If you've been waiting for the Boise market to completely crash, this update might ruin your fantasy a little bit. Because despite inflation climbing again, despite global conflict pushing oil prices higher, and despite buyers spending the last 2 years acting like mortgage rates personally offended them, the Boise market is quietly gaining momentum again. So pending sales are now at their highest level since 2022. Homes in Boise are selling faster. Inventory is climbing, and Idaho just passed 2 major housing laws that could completely reshape development across the Treasure Valley over the next few years. And honestly, this is one of the most important market updates I've done in a while because there are a lot of signals happening at the same time. So today, we're going to break down mortgage rates, Ada County market stats, what's happening with inventory, Boise new pre-approved ADU program, Idaho's new housing laws, and major new developments coming to Meridian and the Micron corridor. And by the end of this video, you should have a much cleaner idea of where the Boise market is heading instead of just another dramatic headline posted this week. Mortgage rate update. Let's start with mortgage rates because honestly, this one surprised a lot of people. The average 30-year fixed mortgage rate actually ticked down slightly this week at 6.36%. That's only a tiny drop from 6.37% the week before, but considering inflation just came in hotter than expected, most people thought rates would continue climbing. For perspective, last year at the same time, rates averaged 6.81%. Now, here's the bigger story underneath that. The latest inflation report showed inflation rose 3.8% year over year, the highest level in 3 years, largely connected to the rising oil prices connected to the ongoing conflict in the Middle East. And what economists are watching closely right now is that higher oil prices are no longer just affecting gas prices. They're starting to bleed into transportation, shipping, consumer goods, services, and overall business costs. So we're in this really strange environment where inflation is still stubborn, rates are elevated, but buyers are slowly adapting instead of sitting completely frozen. And honestly, that adaptation is showing up pretty clearly in Boise's numbers this month. Ada County market update. Let's jump into the overall market update for Ada County stats. We're talking April stats 2026. The biggest takeaway, the market is active when homes are priced correctly. Not chaotic, not pandemic frenzy, but definitely active. Median sales price in Ada County came in at $545,000 overall, down just 0.3% year over year and up 0.7% month over month. So prices are basically flat overall. But here's an interesting detail from the report. The gap between original list price and final sold price narrowed from about $13,000 in March to $8,000 in April. That matters because it suggests sellers are pricing more realistically and the buyers are becoming more willing to engage when a home actually makes sense financially. This isn't the throw any number on Zillow and see what happens era anymore. The market's rewarding strategy again, which honestly is healthier. Now, let's talk sales volume because this is where things start getting more interesting. So Ada County saw 908 homes sold in April, which is up 21.4% year over year and up 12.1% month over month. But Boise specifically saw a pretty significant jump. Boise home sales increased 32% compared to March. And one thing I found fascinating in the report, the average age of homes sold in Boise jumped from 36 years old to 41 years in just 1 month. That likely means buyers are becoming more willing to purchase older resale homes again, focusing almost exclusively on newer construction. And honestly, that makes sense in this environment. Older Boise homes often come with more established neighborhoods, larger lots, mature trees, more central locations, and sometimes better long-term value potential compared to newer suburb inventory. Basically, buyers are widening their criteria again. Pending sales. This may actually be the biggest signal in the entire report. Pending sales increased for the 4th month in a row. Ada County currently has 1,512 pending sales, which is the highest level since April 2022. That's important because pending sales tell us what buyers are doing right now, not what they did 30 to 60 days ago. And despite rates still being in the 6s, buyers are still entering the market. Now, are they more cautious? Absolutely. Are they more payment sensitive? Very much yes. But they are participating. And that's a very different market from the paralysis we saw at certain points over the last 2 years. Inventory also increased again. Ada County now has 1,735 homes on the market. That's up 12.9% month over month. And nearly half of all inventory was just added within the last month. Boise specifically is making up a larger share of these newer listings, but here's the nuance. Even with inventory rising, Boise regional realtors still considers this a seller-leaning market with only 2.2 months supply of inventory. A balanced market typically considered 4.6 months. So while buyers absolutely have more options now, we are not sitting in some massive oversupply situation. And I think this is where people sometimes get tripped up online. More inventory doesn't automatically mean market crash. Sometimes it means people have 3 choices instead of surviving a psychological Hunger Games experience at open houses. Homes are also selling faster again. Average days on market dropped from 31 days to 26 days in Boise, and countrywide averages also declined month over month. The fastest moving resale home right now are actually homes built between 31 and 80 years ago. Again, older established neighborhoods continue pulling strong interest. Boise ADU program. Now let's switch gears because this next story is actually a pretty big deal for homeowners and investors. Boise just launched a fast track ADU program. And if you're unfamiliar, an ADU is an accessory dwelling unit. This could be a guest house, garage apartment, backyard cottage, mother-in-law suite, basically an additional smaller living space on a residential property. The city now offers pre-approved ADU plans, which means homeowners can skip a huge portion of the architectural design process and use city-approved templates instead. That can save time, money, permitting headaches, and a lot of back and forth with the city. The plans include names like Wing Kingfisher, Kestrel Sandpiper, and Osprey. Honestly, Boise naming these after birds feels very on brand somehow. The maximum ADU size is 70% of the primary home size, or 900 square feet, whichever is smaller. And one important detail, no additional parking is required beyond the existing parking for the main home. That's huge, because parking requirements are often one of the biggest reasons ADU projects become difficult or impossible. Now there are still permit fees, impact fees, ACHD fees, and zoning requirements, and not every property qualifies. Flood overlay and hillside overlay properties are excluded from the pre-approved program. But overall, this is a major step increasing gentle density and housing flexibility in Boise. And personally, I think we're gonna see ADUs become a much bigger conversation over the next 5 years in the Treasure Valley, especially for multi-generational living, offsetting mortgage costs, aging parents, college-age kids, long-term rental income, and potentially even midterm furnished rentals. Idaho's new housing laws. And Idaho lawmakers clearly agree housing supply is becoming a priority because Idaho just passed 2 major housing bills, Senate Bill 1352 and Senate Bill 1354. These laws apply to cities with populations over 10,000. So places like Boise, Meridian, Kuna, Eagle, Nampa, Caldwell. Let's talk SB 1352. This bill targets starter home development. Cities now have more limitations on blocking higher density housing developments on parcels larger than 4 acres. This law allows smaller lots, reduced setbacks, narrow widths, and requires cities to allow at least 12 units per acre unless infrastructure issues exist. That's a pretty major shift for Idaho, especially in a state that historically leaned heavily towards lower density suburb development. Let's talk Bill SB 1354. The second bill is arguably even bigger for everyday homeowners. It prevents cities and HOAs from prohibiting ADUs, and it guarantees property owners the right to build at least 1 ADU per lot. That is a substantial policy change, especially when you combine it with Boise's new pre-approved ADU program. So if you zoom out and you clearly see where Idaho policy is heading, more housing flexibility, more infill, more multi-generational living solutions, and more attempts to increase overall housing supply. Meridian development update. Now let's talk development because Meridian just announced a pretty substantial mixed-use expansion. The Eagle View landing project is adding a 125,000 square foot corporate campus, a 7-acre medical campus, a 3-story medical office building, and a concert venue. Construction on the medical and office buildings is expected to begin in 2026 with projected openings of 2027. And this matters because commercial expansion and medical growth are usually strong indicators of long-term regional confidence. You don't typically see this kind of infrastructure investment happening in markets people think are collapsing. Micron and CWI update. And lastly, the College of Western Idaho is expanding workforce education tied to the Micron corridor growth. CWI's new Micron academic building will be 100,000 square feet, focused on business, cybersecurity, IT, adult education, and workforce training programs. This is one of those stories that might sound less exciting on the surface, but long-term, this is exactly the kind of infrastructure that supports sustained economic growth. More education, more workforce training, more tech pipeline development, and more employment support. And all of that feeds into housing demand over time. So overall, the Boise market right now feels less like a crash market and more like a market trying to normalize still while dealing with affordable pressure, higher rates, and majority population and infrastructure growth. Inventory is improving, buyers are re-engaging, pending sales are climbing, homes are still moving when priced correctly. And meanwhile, Idaho is actively rewriting housing policy to encourage more development and density moving forward, which honestly makes this one of the more fascinating transition periods we've had in a while. If you're thinking about relocating to Boise, buying, selling, building an ADU, investing, or just trying to understand where this market is heading, feel free to reach out. I will put all my contact information below amongst a bunch of free amazing guides. And if you enjoyed this market update, make sure to subscribe because I do these every month and break down what's actually happening here locally without the national clickbait panic spiral. I'll see you in the next one.